In the mid-19th century, the United States stood poised between triumph and tragedy. The dream of manifest destiny drove settlers westward, fueled by faith, ambition, and the belief that this young republic was destined to cover the continent. But while Americans celebrated expansion, another struggle brewed beneath the surface, a moral and political conflict that no victory on the battlefield could solve. This is the story of that gathering storm. This is the American Civil War, a nation torn apart. Across 10 episodes, we will trace the rise, the conflict, and the aftermath of a war that reshaped not only a country, but the very meaning of freedom. Stay with us as we begin with the years before the first gunfire, the years when prosperity masked division and the fate of a nation was quietly being decided. In 1846, the United States went to war with Mexico. It was a war of expansion, justified by many as destiny, condemned by others as greed. The conflict began over disputed territory in Texas, but soon became something much larger, a struggle that would add vast new lands to the United States, from California to New Mexico, and bring with them a question the nation had long avoided. Would slavery expand westward, or would these new territories remain free? The Mexican-American War was brief but brutal. Young officers who would one day fight each other at Gettysburg, and Shiloh learned their trade beneath the same flag. Among them was Jefferson Davis, a West Point graduate who commanded with skill and bravery. Robert E. Lee served with distinction, as did Ulysses S. Grant. For them and thousands of others, this war was a proving ground. Yet for all its victories, it would leave a legacy more dangerous than defeat. The United States emerged from the war larger, prouder, and richer in land, but poorer in unity. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo in 1848 ceded nearly half of Mexico's territory to the United States. It was a triumph of arms, but it reignited the question that haunted Congress, the press, and the public. Would slavery be permitted in these vast new regions? The issue that had divided the nation since its birth could no longer be ignored. In the North, many saw expansion as a chance to spread free labor, industry, and democratic values. To them, slavery was not only immoral but economically backward, a relic of an older world. In the South, slaveholding states viewed the same lands as their birthright, earned by American blood. They believed their agricultural system, built on enslaved labor, must follow the flag into every new territory. Both sides claimed the Constitution as their shield, and both feared domination by the other. The debate was not merely political, it was existential. Could a republic founded on liberty continue to tolerate human bondage? Could a government built on compromise survive when its compromises protected injustice? Across the country, newspapers, churches, and public halls echoed with argument. Each side spoke the language of freedom, but meant something entirely different. As Congress struggled to respond, tempers flared. The Wilmot Proviso of 1846 sought to ban slavery in any territory gained from Mexico. It passed the House of Representatives but failed in the Senate. The measure itself died, but its shadow remained. It had revealed the fault line dividing the nation, not between parties but between regions. Northerners and Southerners no longer trusted each other to defend the Union's balance. Through the late 1840s, political leaders tried to calm the storm. Some urged moderation, others whispered of secession. The question of slavery's expansion threatened to shatter the delicate balance of power between free and slave states. For every new free state, the South demanded a slave state to maintain equality in the Senate. Yet the geography of the new territories made that balance increasingly impossible. In 1848, the discovery of gold in California drew hundreds of thousands westward. Within months, what had been a remote province of Mexico became a booming land of fortune seekers and merchants. By 1849, California petitioned to join the Union as a free state. The South resisted fiercely. Admission of California would tip the scales toward the North and set a precedent that could confine slavery to the South forever. The debates in Washington grew fierce. Senators thundered about rights, sovereignty, and destiny. Newspapers warned of disunion. Across the nation, ordinary citizens began to speak of war, not with foreign powers, but among themselves. America, barely 70 years old, faced a question its founders had postponed and could no longer avoid. Out of this tension came the Compromise of 1850, a desperate attempt to preserve unity. Crafted by a generation of aging statesmen, Henry Clay, Daniel Webster, and John C. Calhoun, it sought to settle the territorial disputes once and for all. California would enter the Union as a free state. The territories of New Mexico and Utah would decide for themselves whether to allow slavery. The slave trade, though not slavery itself, would be abolished in the District of Columbia. For the South, one crucial concession made the deal tolerable: the Fugitive Slave Act. This law required that escaped slaves be returned to their owners, even if they reached free states. It compelled ordinary citizens, judges, and local officials in the North to aid in their capture. Those who refused could face fines or imprisonment. The compromise passed, and for a brief moment, relief swept through Washington. Politicians congratulated themselves on saving the Union. Newspapers proclaimed that the crisis was over. Yet beneath the celebration lay unease. The Compromise of 1850 did not solve the problem. It merely postponed it, binding the nation more tightly to a moral contradiction. In northern cities like Boston and Philadelphia, the Fugitive Slave Act turned quiet streets into battlegrounds. Free black communities organized resistance. Abolitionists defied federal marshals, sometimes violently, to protect fugitives. Courtrooms filled with scenes of anguish, as accused men and women were dragged back into bondage. The law, intended to preserve peace, inflamed outrage. In the South, slaveholders viewed the act as vindication, proof that the federal government recognized their rights. They demanded its strict enforcement and saw Northern resistance as rebellion. What Southerners called constitutional duty, Northerners now called tyranny. Trust between the regions, once fragile, began to crumble entirely. As 1850 drew to a close, America stood at a crossroads. The Union remained intact, but only by silencing the question it feared most. In the fields of Georgia, the plantations of Mississippi, and the factories of Massachusetts, two worlds coexisted uneasily. One was modern, industrial, and increasingly urban. The other was rural, agricultural, and dependent on enslaved labor. Their interests could not remain aligned forever. The political generation that had guided America since the Revolution was fading. Clay, Webster, and Calhoun, the great triumvirate, would all be dead within 2 years. Their successors inherited not peace but paralysis. Each new law, each new compromise became a temporary bandage on a wound that refused to heal. Yet there were Americans who still believed the Union would endure. Many ordinary citizens wished only to live and prosper, convinced that reason and faith would prevail. But as history would show, nations rarely escape the weight of their contradictions. By the early 1850s, the United States had become a paradox, a democracy that preached liberty while protecting bondage, a nation that sought progress while clinging to its past. The war with Mexico had fulfilled the dream of expansion, but it had also unleashed a question that no treaty could settle. Who was free and who decided? In statehouses and taverns, in pulpits and on plantations, the arguments continued. Ministers quoted scripture on both sides of the debate. Politicians appealed to patriotism, even as they prepared for division. Newspapers exaggerated every rumor of discontent. The air of optimism that had followed victory over Mexico gave way to suspicion and fear. The generation that had fought the Mexican War now returned home to a divided country. For officers like Jefferson Davis, the lessons of that war would soon be tested on home soil. For the young Illinois lawyer named Abraham Lincoln, the events of the late 1840s stirred both outrage and purpose. He would soon rise from obscurity to become the voice of a new political movement, one that promised to halt the spread of slavery and preserve the Union, whatever the cost. But that story was still to come. For now, the nation stood uneasy, convinced that compromise had saved it once again. In reality, the fuse had already been lit. The expansion that had made America strong had also made it fragile, stretching its unity thin across a continent. The years between 1846 and 1850 marked the calm before the storm, the illusion of peace before the tempest. Every new law, every new territory carried with it the echo of a question unanswered. Could one nation, half free and half enslaved, endure? As the decade turned, that question grew louder. Political parties splintered, sectional loyalties hardened. The dream of manifest destiny had been realized, but at a price the nation did not yet comprehend. The victory over Mexico had redrawn the map of America. Soon it would redraw its soul. The Compromise of 1850 would hold the Union together for another decade, but only just. In its shadow, new movements were already taking shape. Abolitionists intensified their campaigns. Southern leaders began to whisper the word secession. And somewhere in the heartland, a tall, quiet man from Illinois prepared to enter the political stage. The story of the Civil War does not begin with cannon fire or marching armies. It begins here, in debate halls and dusty frontier towns, in laws written to postpone truth. It begins in the victories that sowed division, and in the compromises that concealed collapse. The storm before the war has begun. By the middle of the 1850s, the uneasy calm that had settled after the Compromise of 1850 began to fracture. For a few brief years, Americans had convinced themselves that the great national debate over slavery could be contained by law. But the question of human bondage could not be legislated away. The storm that had rumbled quietly beneath the surface was about to break open, and the first drops of blood would fall on the plains of Kansas. The man who struck the match was Senator Stephen A. Douglas of Illinois, an ambitious and skilled politician who dreamed of building a transcontinental railroad. To secure Southern support for his plan, Douglas proposed the Kansas-Nebraska Act in early 1854. It seemed at first a simple measure, organizing the vast territories west of Missouri into Kansas and Nebraska, opening the land for settlement and development. But within its text lay a fatal idea. The act declared that the settlers of each territory could decide for themselves whether to allow slavery, a principle Douglas called popular sovereignty. He believed it was democratic, a way to remove the slavery question from Congress and place it in the hands of the people. In truth, it reopened every wound the Compromise of 1850 had tried to close. The Missouri Compromise of 1820 had long banned slavery north of latitude 36-30. Now, Douglas's proposal would repeal that restriction, making slavery possible in territories once thought forever free. The reaction was immediate and explosive. In the North, outrage spread like wildfire. Newspapers denounced the bill as a betrayal. Public meetings filled with citizens who demanded that free soil remain free. In the South, the proposal was celebrated as a long overdue correction of Northern arrogance. The lines dividing the two regions, once blurred, became unmistakable. In Congress, the debate over the Kansas-Nebraska Act was fierce and bitter. Old alliances dissolved overnight. The Whig Party, once one of the two great political forces in America, tore itself apart along sectional lines. Northern Whigs who opposed the act found themselves politically homeless. Out of their anger and disillusionment emerged a new movement, the Republican Party, united by a single purpose: to prevent the expansion of slavery into the Western territories. When the Kansas-Nebraska Act passed in May 1854, the celebration in the South was matched only by the fury in the North. The ink on the bill was scarcely dry before settlers and agitators began to pour into the new territories. Pro-slavery Missourians crossed the border into Kansas to influence the vote, while northern abolitionists and free soil settlers rushed to counter them. Towns sprang up almost overnight: Lawrence, Leavenworth, and Topeka, each side determined to claim the land and its future. The principle of popular sovereignty was being tested, and it quickly failed. Elections were riddled with fraud and intimidation. Armed bands calling themselves border ruffians rode in from Missouri to stuff ballot boxes and terrorize anti-slavery voters. Pro-slavery forces established a territorial government at Lecompton, while their opponents formed a rival government in Topeka. Kansas now had two legislatures, two constitutions, and two visions of America. Violence soon followed. In 1856, a pro-slavery mob attacked and looted the Free State town of Lawrence, burning buildings and destroying printing presses. The attack shocked the nation. In response, an abolitionist named John Brown decided that the time for talk had ended. John Brown was a man of deep faith and unyielding conviction. To him, slavery was not merely a political evil, but a sin against God, and those who upheld it were enemies of the divine will. With a band of followers, including his sons, Brown struck back. On a dark May night in 1856, near Pottawatomie Creek, they dragged 5 pro-slavery men from their homes and executed them with brutal precision. Brown believed he was enacting divine justice. Others called it murder. The killings ignited a wave of violence across the territory. Retaliation followed retaliation. Towns burned, militias formed, and Kansas descended into chaos. The newspapers called it Bleeding Kansas, a name that captured both the physical and moral wounds of the nation. More than 200 people would die in the fighting, a prelude to the far greater bloodshed that lay ahead. As Kansas bled, so too did the nation's political civility. In Washington, tempers that had long simmered finally boiled over. In May 1856, Senator Charles Sumner of Massachusetts delivered a blistering speech condemning the Kansas-Nebraska Act and its Southern supporters. He singled out Senator Andrew Butler of South Carolina, mocking him personally and denouncing the harlot slavery he defended. 2 days later, Butler's relative, Representative Preston Brooks, entered the Senate chamber carrying a heavy cane. Finding Sumner seated at his desk, Brooks struck him repeatedly across the head and shoulders until the cane splintered. Sumner collapsed, bleeding and unconscious, his desk bolted to the floor and his body trapped beneath it. He would not return to the Senate for 3 years. The attack shocked the North and thrilled the South. In northern cities, it was seen as proof that the slave power would silence freedom of speech with violence. In the South, Brooks was celebrated as a hero who had defended Southern honor. Supporters sent him new canes, some engraved with the words, "Hit him again." The assault on the Senate floor became a symbol of the nation's descent into hatred. While Congress fought with words and fists, events in Kansas grew even more tangled. Competing governments sent rival constitutions to Washington, each claiming legitimacy. President Franklin Pierce, sympathetic to the South, recognized the pro-slavery legislature, deepening Northern mistrust. The conflict in Kansas had become more than a territorial dispute. It was a moral referendum on the soul of the Republic. Meanwhile, the young Republican Party began to gain strength. It drew abolitionists, free soilers, and former Whigs into a single coalition united by one idea: that slavery must not spread. Its message appealed to Northerners who feared that the slave system threatened free labor and democracy itself. Within 2 years of its birth, the Republican Party had become a major political force, reshaping the national debate. But even as new parties formed, the Supreme Court prepared to deliver a decision that would shake the country to its core. In 1857, the case of Dred Scott versus Sanford came before the court. Dred Scott was an enslaved man who had lived for several years with his owner in Illinois and the Wisconsin Territory, lands where slavery was prohibited. Scott sued for his freedom, arguing that his residence in free territory made him a free man. His case wound its way through the courts for years, becoming a symbol for both sides in the national debate. When the Supreme Court finally issued its ruling, the decision stunned the North. Chief Justice Roger B. Taney declared that black people, whether enslaved or free, could not be citizens of the United States and had no right to sue in federal court. He went further still, ruling that Congress had no authority to prohibit slavery in any territory. The Missouri Compromise, Taney declared, was unconstitutional. In one sweeping judgment, the court had undone decades of legislative effort to contain slavery. Every Western territory was now theoretically open to it. For the South, the decision was a triumph, affirming that their property rights were protected by the Constitution. For the North, it was a disaster, proof that the nation's highest court had become an instrument of the slave power. Newspapers in Boston and Chicago denounced the decision as a betrayal of the Declaration of Independence. Public meetings filled with angry citizens demanding resistance. Abraham Lincoln, still a lawyer in Illinois, read the decision with alarm. He warned that if the court could erase Congress's power over slavery, the next step might be legalizing it everywhere. Even in the free states, the Dred Scott decision deepened the sense that the machinery of government itself was broken. Laws, compromises, and courts all had failed to resolve the question that haunted the Republic: What had begun as a debate over the rights of states and territories had become a struggle for the nation's moral identity. By 1857, the phrase "bleeding Kansas" had entered common speech, a shorthand for the country's divisions. The territory remained a war zone. Guerrilla raids continued. Homes burned and families fled. The dream of peaceful settlement had dissolved into fear. To the world beyond, the United States, so confident in its democracy, seemed unable to govern itself. In Washington, political parties realigned once again. The Democrats split between northern and southern factions. The Whigs were gone, replaced by the Republicans in the north and by smaller regional groups in the south. The old system of compromise and shared governance had collapsed. Every debate in Congress now carried the echo of disunion. The violence in Kansas also altered the national conscience. Until then, many Americans had viewed the conflict over slavery as an abstract moral issue, distant from daily life. But the images of burning towns, murdered settlers, and brutal reprisals made it real. The question was no longer whether slavery was right or wrong, but whether Americans could still live together under one flag. Amid the bloodshed, John Brown became both a symbol and a warning. To some, he was a fanatic who had taken justice into his own hands. To others, a prophet who had dared to fight the slave system by force. His actions divided even the abolitionist movement, yet Brown's name would not fade. He would reappear 2 years later, wielding his sword not in Kansas but in Virginia, where he would try to spark a nationwide uprising. For now, though, the immediate result of the Kansas crisis was disillusionment. Many Americans began to believe that the political system could no longer contain the forces tearing the nation apart. The promise of popular sovereignty had devolved into mob rule. The authority of Congress had given way to chaos. The Kansas-Nebraska Act had been meant to bring progress, to open new lands, encourage settlement, and spread democracy. Instead, it had unleashed a miniature civil war. The dream of national unity that had guided the founders was now fading into a nightmare of division. By the late 1850s, a new kind of rhetoric dominated American life. Politicians no longer spoke of compromise, but of confrontation. Newspapers in the North printed headlines warning of a slave power conspiracy. Southern editors, in turn, railed against abolition tyranny. The press, the pulpit, and the platform became weapons. The nation's public discourse had turned into a battlefield. Still, some clung to hope. There were moderates who insisted that reason and patriotism would prevail. They believed that the bonds of family, trade, and faith would keep the Union together. But the evidence around them told another story. Kansas had shown that the struggle over slavery could no longer be contained by borders or laws. It would spread, consuming everything in its path. The beating of Charles Sumner, the rise of the Republican Party, the Dred Scott decision, all were chapters in the same unfolding tragedy. The phrase "the nation bleeds" was no metaphor. Blood had already been spilled, not in a single battle but in dozens of small skirmishes that scarred the American frontier. The lessons learned there would soon be repeated on a far greater scale. As 1857 came to a close, the United States was a country divided in spirit, if not yet in form. The forces that had bound it together, commerce, faith, and a shared revolutionary heritage, were losing their power. The center could no longer hold. The nation was bleeding slowly but steadily. Every compromise had failed. Every institution meant to unite had instead become a weapon of division. In the next years, new leaders would rise, some preaching reconciliation, others preparing for secession, and among them stood one man from Illinois, whose words would soon frame the conflict that was to come. A house divided against itself cannot stand. The storm had begun in Kansas, but its thunder was rolling eastward. The fields and towns that had once symbolized opportunity now stood as warnings of what awaited the entire Union. The blood that soaked Kansas soil was only the beginning. The decade neared its end, and with it, America's fragile balance. The nation was no longer just debating the morality of slavery. It was debating its very soul. The 1850s had revealed the deep cracks in the American experiment. What had once been disagreements between politicians had become a struggle between two visions of the republic, one built on the labor of the enslaved and another built on the promise of freedom for all. By 1858, the coming storm could be felt in every corner of the country. In Illinois, far from the great plantations of the South and the factories of the North, a tall, lean lawyer began to capture the nation's attention. Abraham Lincoln was not a man of privilege. Born in a log cabin in Kentucky, raised in frontier poverty and largely self-educated, he embodied the restless ambition of the expanding West. His voice carried the plain speech of the common man, but behind it lay sharp intellect and moral fire. Across from him stood Stephen A. Douglas, short, forceful, and immensely skilled in politics. Douglas had been one of the architects of the Kansas-Nebraska Act, a man who believed in popular sovereignty, that the people of each territory should decide for themselves whether to permit slavery. To many, he was the champion of democracy. To others, he was the symbol of moral compromise. In the summer of 1858, the two men faced each other in one of the most famous debates in American history, the Lincoln-Douglas debates. 7 encounters across the state of Illinois, in open fields and courthouse squares, where thousands gathered to hear the clash of ideas. The stakes were high, not just for Illinois, but for the soul of the Union itself. Douglas spoke with the confidence of a man defending the established order. He declared that the Union could endure half slave and half free, so long as each state and territory could choose its destiny. He warned that those who wanted to impose morality on politics threatened liberty itself. Lincoln disagreed. He rose before the crowds and spoke words that would echo through history. "A house divided against itself cannot stand." It was a simple sentence, but it struck like a thunderclap. Lincoln declared that the United States could not permanently exist half slave and half free. It would become all one thing or all the other. To the South, Lincoln's words sounded like a declaration of war. To many in the North, they were a call to conscience. The debates became more than a contest for a Senate seat. They were a national argument played out before an audience that spanned the Republic. Newspapers across the country printed every word. Though Douglas would win the election, Lincoln had captured the nation's imagination. His words, measured yet unyielding, revealed a moral seriousness rare in politics. Lincoln's rise mirrored the growing moral clarity of the North. Abolitionism, once dismissed as a fringe cause, had begun to find new voice. The writings of Frederick Douglass, a man born into slavery, and now one of the most powerful orators in the nation, reached wider audiences. Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin continued to stir hearts. The image of slavery was no longer distant. It was personal, moral, and impossible to ignore. But the South saw things differently. To them, the growing criticism of slavery was not moral progress. It was an existential threat. Their entire economy rested on enslaved labor. Cotton was the backbone of their wealth, and Europe's textile mills depended on it. To attack slavery was, in their eyes, to attack their way of life, and the constitutional protections they believed guaranteed it. The more the North condemned slavery, the more the South defended it as a moral good. Southern politicians began to speak openly about the righteousness of the system. They claimed that slavery was sanctioned by the Bible, that it brought civilization to those they enslaved, and that Northern hypocrisy, living off Southern cotton while condemning its source, was intolerable. In 1859, a single man would throw the entire nation into panic. His name was John Brown. Brown was a radical abolitionist who believed slavery could never end through words alone. 2 years earlier, he had fought and killed pro-slavery men in Kansas. Now he set his sights on a far bolder plan, to strike at the heart of slavery itself. On the night of October 16, 1859, Brown and a small band of followers attacked the federal arsenal at Harper's Ferry, Virginia. His goal was simple: seize the weapons, arm the enslaved, and spark a massive rebellion that would sweep through the South. But the plan failed. Within hours, Brown and his men were surrounded by local militia and U.S. Marines commanded by Colonel Robert E. Lee. Brown was captured, wounded, and soon put on trial for treason. During his trial, Brown spoke not like a criminal but like a prophet. Calmly, he declared that he had meant only to free the oppressed. His words, printed in newspapers, electrified the North and enraged the South. When he was executed in December 1859, Bells tolled in northern towns, as if for a martyr. In the South, men swore that if such men as Brown were heroes in the North, then the Union was already dead. The Harper's Ferry raid deepened the fear that slavery's enemies would stop at nothing. It also convinced many Southerners that they could no longer trust the North. The idea of secession, once whispered only by extremists, began to spread into the mainstream of Southern politics. In the North, meanwhile, Brown's death forced reflection. Many admired his courage but feared his methods. Yet his actions, violent as they were, pushed the question of slavery into every home, every newspaper, every pulpit. America could no longer look away. As the nation absorbed the shock of Harper's Ferry, politics entered a new and volatile phase. The Democratic Party, long the bridge between North and South, began to fracture. Northern Democrats, led by men like Stephen Douglas, still clung to the idea of popular sovereignty. Southern Democrats demanded federal protection for slavery in all territories, a demand that made compromise nearly impossible. And in this chaos, a new political force gained momentum: the Republican Party. Born just a few years earlier, it was a coalition of former Whigs, Free Soilers, and anti-slavery Democrats united by one principle: opposition to the spread of slavery. By 1860, the Republicans prepared to choose their candidate for president. The leading names were well-known men from the East: William Seward of New York, Salmon P. Chase of Ohio. Yet it was the little-known lawyer from Illinois who would surprise them all. When the Republican convention opened in Chicago in May 1860, Lincoln's supporters filled the vast wooden hall with organized energy. They carried banners, chanted his name, and played on his humble origins. The rail splitter from Illinois, a man of the people, self-made and moderate, was presented as the face of a new America. Through shrewd political maneuvering and careful alliances, Lincoln emerged as the nominee on the third ballot. His platform was clear: slavery would not be allowed to expand into the territories, yet he promised not to interfere with it where it already existed. To the South, that promise meant little. They heard only that a man who had declared the nation a house divided was now poised to become president. Newspapers across the southern states warned that Lincoln's election would mean the end of their world. The 1860 campaign became a mirror of the nation's divisions. 4 major candidates ran: Abraham Lincoln for the Republicans, Stephen Douglas for the Northern Democrats, John C. Breckinridge for the Southern Democrats, and John Bell for the Constitutional Union Party, which tried to appeal to those desperate to avoid disunion. The debates were fierce, the rhetoric heated. The South warned that if Lincoln won, secession would follow. The North feared that if the South broke away, the dream of the Union would collapse. When the votes were counted in November 1860, Abraham Lincoln had won with a clear majority of electoral votes, but not a single one from the southern states. In the popular vote, he secured less than 40%. His victory was not a national consensus, it was a sectional triumph. For many Southerners, that fact confirmed their worst fears. They saw that a president could now be elected without the support of the South at all. To them, it meant the Union no longer represented them. Within weeks, the first rumblings of disunion began. On December 20th, 1860, South Carolina became the first state to secede from the Union. The declaration was bold and unapologetic. It accused the northern states of violating the Constitution and threatening the institution of slavery. In the months that followed, 6 more states joined South Carolina: Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas. By February 1861, before Lincoln had even taken office, these 7 states had formed a new government, the Confederate States of America. Jefferson Davis, a Mississippi senator and former U.S. Secretary of War, was chosen as its president. In his inaugural speech, Davis claimed that the South sought not revolution, but independence, asserting their right to self-government as their fathers had done in 1776. The nation had split. The storm that had been gathering for decades had finally broken. As Lincoln prepared to leave his home in Springfield, Illinois for Washington, he understood the gravity of what awaited him. In his farewell speech to his neighbors, his voice trembled. I now leave, not knowing when or whether ever I may return. A duty devolves upon me greater than that which has devolved upon any other man since Washington. In the capital, tension thickened. Southern representatives withdrew from Congress. Federal forts and arsenals in the seceded states were seized by local militias. The Union's authority was crumbling before Lincoln even took the oath. When he was inaugurated on March 4, 1861, he faced a nation on the brink. He spoke to my dissatisfied fellow countrymen, pleading for peace, declaring that we are not enemies, but friends. Yet his words could not bridge the divide. In Charleston Harbor, South Carolina, federal troops still held Fort Sumter, and all eyes turned there. The question was no longer whether war would come, but when. And so the final years before the war closed with a haunting silence, a calm heavy with dread. The United States, once bound by ideals of liberty and unity, now stood as two nations on the same continent, each convinced of its righteousness, each preparing for the conflict to come. The storm that had been gathering for decades was about to break. In our next episode, we witness the final collapse of unity. As Lincoln takes office, the South forms its own nation, and the first shots of the Civil War echo across the sea. Stay with us and subscribe to our channel so you don't miss the next episodes of the American Civil War, the story of a nation divided and the people who fought to define its soul.